Welcome everyone to the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series, and thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about ways to take a fresh look at logic models to enhance and amplify their value to your organization. Though they've been around for some time, logic models continue to see limited use in comparison to their potential, so we're really going to take a look at this today. We're joined by two excellent panelists who will walk us through ways to use, assess, and revise logic models for various organizational needs. Jennifer Burgoyne, Program Manager at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, will be running the presentation slides today. So let's get started. This webinar is part of the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series, which is funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention through the National Mentoring Resource Center and facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. These webinars would not be possible without the planning team, which includes the mentoring partnership shown on this slide. In addition to this webinar series, the NMRC provides resources for mentoring practitioners. At the end of this webinar, we'll provide more details about how you can access this free support, including technical assistance, consulting, and training. This webinar is going to be great, and we want you to have what you need to do this work. So before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. In 1 week, we will send out an email with information about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also just go directly to Mentor's website and access this within the next week. And of course, we always want to continually improve the series, so we're looking for your input. We'll have a short survey that pops up at the end of the webinar as you exit. Please just take a couple minutes to give us your feedback so we can continue to make this better and meet your needs. We also really want this to be an interactive experience. So please use the question box on your control panel to ask questions throughout the webinar. Our awesome question moderator, Dusty Ann North from California, will be selecting some of the highlights to share with panelists during the Q&A portion of this webinar. We can't get to all of the questions because there are so many of you on the webinar. We've got 166 so far. So we're really looking for questions that we can share with our panelists that generally are going to broaden or deepen the conversation overall. And please keep in mind that we can't address specific needs of individual programs during this time. So if we don't get to your question and you have some specific questions, we definitely encourage you to follow up with our panelists directly. So first, we'd like to get a sense of who's with us today, and we have two short polls to do this. So we're going to launch our first poll, which is to get a better understanding of what your experience level is in the mentoring field. All right, excellent. So we have 33% who are beginners. Welcome. We hope you'll join us for the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series again. And we have 60% who are experienced. Fantastic. A lot of people returning. And finally, 6% of experts. Thank you guys for being here. Our second poll is just to get a little bit more understanding about what your role is in the mentoring field. How are you involved? So are you a practitioner, a researcher, or a technical assistance provider? All right. So this is excellent. A lot of practitioners on the call, 46% of you, which is so wonderful because logic models can, often kind of be left to leadership. So we love that we have lots of people involved who are going to be, actively engaged in this conversation and pushing logic models to various parts of our organization. We also have 12% of researchers, 12% technical assistance providers, a couple funders on the line, and then 25% other. And we'd love to know who those others are. Excellent. So we welcome everyone and hope today's information will be applicable to your needs. To get us started, I just wanted to go over what our objectives are for the day. So our first objective is to go beyond grants and use logic models fully to enhance all aspects of our organization, to gain real approaches to assessing logic models, and finally, to learn to revise logic models to start to increase our outcomes. So now for our introduction. I'm Audrey Siegfried from Colorado, and I'll be your facilitator for this webinar. I've been on the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series team for the last 2 years, and I serve as a consultant and trainer with Mentor Colorado, Colorado's statewide mentoring partnership. So now let's check out our panelists for today's webinar. I'm joined by Sam McQuillin, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at University of South Carolina, and Susan Duncombe, who is our Chief Operating Officer at Denver Urban Scholars. So just to give a little more background on our panelists, Sam studies how schools and communities can work together to promote emotional, behavioral, and academic wellness in children who are environmentally or developmentally at risk. He developed a youth mentoring program for early adolescent children based on practices from motivational interviewing. Sam's a research board member of the National Mentoring Resource Center, a Society for the Study of School Psychology Early Career Award recipient, and the director of University of South Carolina's and University of Houston's AMPS Youth Mentoring Program. He also serves as a quantitative methodologist on a broad range of research projects. Sam completed his doctoral work at the University of South Carolina and attended the APA accredited internship at Cypress Fairbanks ISD in Cypress, Texas. Prior to joining faculty at USC, he was an assistant professor of school psychology at the University of Houston for 4 years. Welcome to the panel, Sam. And now on to Susan. Susan has over 19 years of experience in the nonprofit sector working with youth and families as an AmeriCorps Vista in Northeast Denver. She started a school readiness program for Spanish-speaking toddlers and their parents. After traveling throughout Mexico and Central America, Susan came back and worked in a women's shelter in New Mexico, returning to Denver to earn her master's in social work from the University of Denver. After working in day treatment and residential treatment as a bilingual family therapist, she began her tenure with Denver Urban Scholars in 2008 as a youth development coordinator. After then serving as resident services director with an affordable housing organization, she returned to Denver Urban Scholars in January 2014 as program director, then transitioning to VP of programs and currently serving as COO. She's excited each day to be a part of a dedicated community of youth, families, mentors, staff, board members, volunteers, and community partners, all working towards impacting the graduation rate and overall life success of youth in Denver. Welcome, Susan, to our panel. All right, so thank you all so much for being here. Today, we are going to have the opportunity to check out what goes into developing, assessing, and revising effective, aligned, and beneficial logic models for your organizations. I'm super excited to be a part of this conversation because I think many of us don't even realize the full breadth of how our logic models can be used to really impact change. So to get us started, the terms theory of change and logic model get used interchangeably. So I think it would be really helpful for us to have a little bit of background information, context, and definitions to kind of lay the framework for this. So Sam, could you provide us with a little bit of an overview of logic models, theory of change, what the differences are, all this important information to help us out?
Sure. So one of the things to consider is that, one, there's many different types of logic models, and if you ask one expert how to do a logic model, you might get a different answer from a different expert. And the same thing happens with theory of change and logic models. There's some gray areas between them, but there are some distinctive features that can help us think about these and also help us think about, hey, which one do we want to use, a logic model or a theory of change? In general, theory of change models focus on why questions. Why do things happen the way that they do? For example, why do mentors cause mentees to do better in school or to feel happier with their life? So theories of change generally focus on explaining testable assumptions between program activities and outcomes. Like the title suggests, it's testing these theories or providing some logic behind how the theories are connected. So for example, you might see in a theory of change something like mentors provide a sense of warmth that makes mentees want to come to school more. That's a why question. Why does this work? Or you might see something like proactive staff support leads to greater mentor self-efficacy, and mentors are more likely to adapt and persist through difficult relationship seasons. So it's an explanation of why these things are working. So on the other hand, logic models get more at what questions, what and how. What do we have? What do we do? And how do we do it? So the focus in logic models is more on implementation. What are our material resources? How do we use them? What do we get from using them? And how does what we get correspond with our mission? So another way to think about this that we'll talk a little bit more later about reducing uncertainty is theories of change help reduce uncertainty around the theory of why the program works. It details a testable theoretical assumption that you can go out and try to falsify. Logic models, on the other hand, which is the focus of this webinar, help reduce uncertainty about what the program is and how it operates. It details testable operational assumptions, how the program is working and what goes into it. So one way to look at this is to take a look at a quick example. In a logic model, you might have that we have this, mentor training or mentor curriculum for academics. It might be one little, blip in our activities section. A theory of change would actually break that down into the component parts, like what goes into the training or the curriculum that we're getting. First, it facilitates a growth mindset, and then this growth mindset leads to these sparks that we have. And then attitudes change as a consequence of that. And then once the attitudes change, the behaviors change. And then finally, we get to improved grades. So basic idea is that we're taking a component from something we do and really mapping out why does this work or why do we think it works. And then in logic models, we typically see this type of framework. There are some variations as we discussed, but really it's focused on how the program operates. What do we have? What are our inputs or material resources, which are our inputs? What are our activities, or what do we do with those material resources in our program? Is it, meeting with mentors, meet with mentees? Sometimes in activities, you'll see them broken up between administrative activities and then program-specific activities. And then from those activities, what do we produce? And these are typically things that are objectively measurable, like 15 mentors meet with 30 mentees, or there's 14 hours of training total delivered. And then our outcomes really get at those short, intermediate, and long-term mission goals that we're trying to achieve. Students have more access to college, they have happier lives, they have more choices when they leave high school, and so on. And then finally, the assumptions box is something that is included sometimes but excluded other times, and this is where the lines kind of blur between a theory of change and a logic model, and this is where you might detail some specific assumptions that you have between how your inputs connect with activities or how your activities connect with outputs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam, for walking us through that. I think that it's, it's a really important thing to have this kind of background information as we now delve into our actual program experiences with this and some examples. So let's take a look at what this could actually look like in real life and how programs are using logic models. So to start us off, Susan, can you actually walk us through your logic model that you use at Denver Urban Scholars? What went into the development of this, how you actually use it, and then I also know that you use a couple different logic models. So if you could just kind of talk us through that process, that would be excellent as well.
Sure. So this is an example of our milestones or high school program logic model. We have a middle school program, a high school program, and then a post-secondary program. And we found it most useful to have a logic model for each of those programs that feeds into an overall logic model. For the purposes of the webinar today, I've submitted this example that I, just for formatting, some of the outputs and some of the activities aren't showing up. But as you all on the call are probably used to, some of this, it does often feel like it's for funders. And so it's been really important for us to figure out how do we take what funders want to see in this specific format, but then bring it to life and make it useful within our own agency. For us, it was helpful to start with goals and long-term outcomes and kind of work backwards from there to put into the model, what are we holding ourselves accountable to? And we're focused on the social emotional development and academic success of youth in middle school, high school, and post-secondary. So we've come up with the outcomes that we've put into the model that we're holding ourselves accountable to, and then what are those outputs that get us there, and then what are the activities that we are going to be focused on, the practitioners who are on the front lines, our program managers, what are those specific things they are going to be doing, and who is playing a role. It's not just the practitioners, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes in terms of resources that are impacting those activities. We really see the logic model as the guide to ensure that everything we're doing in terms of activities is going to have some relation to our short-term outcomes as well as those long-term outcomes. This is an example of an additional tool that we use, excuse me, that helps us continue to have a process and terminology for our frontline staff who typically, you know, when they hear the idea of like, oh, we're going to look at our logic model, or we're going to use the logic model, there are eye rolls all over the place, right? Our frontline staff want to be able to focus so much on the mentees and the mentors and our school partners, but it's been important for us to adapt tools and terminology that is allowing for them to be bought in, to come to the table when we have discussions, and we'll get into this later in the webinar, some of the tools that we specifically have used, including a program model learning agenda, including a data audit, including an emergent learning map. We've adjusted our logic model to be more of a program model where it's getting into even more detail than what the logic model has around who specifically is doing what, how many times per month are they doing that. Really, really specific. And so we spend a lot of time really focused on changing our program model, which then informs the changes that need to be made to our logic model. And you know, as you probably got from my bio, I didn't come into this as a researcher. And I think it's really important for any of you on the call who, you know, you're still in your professional development around evaluation. We know it's so important as practitioners. And I think finding the ways to use these tools and adjust the terminology to make it come to life within your organization is what is so critical.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, Susan. And I just have a follow-up question for you, actually, before we move on to this next logic model. You had mentioned, you know, having this terminology, this language. Could you just speak a little bit more as to, I guess, the value of having that shared language for your stakeholders and how that, I guess, provides you with some additional value as an organization?
Sure. I think for some reason I feel like logic models have gotten a bad rap, right? And so instead of just saying logic model, it's more like we're going to talk about the activities that are impacting our outcomes. And as we talk about tools, you'll see some of the details of the way we specifically are talking about that. When I say let's look at our program model and our program model articulation to really define who's doing what and when and where and how that impacts resources. Are we spending resources on activities that matter to then inform outcomes? That just, it just gives kind of meaning to the words. When I say logic model, I think at least within our organization, people still think, oh, we're just doing that for funder. But when you really spell out what does that mean, what is it that's behind activities? What is it that behind short-term outcomes? I think for our folks too, they wear a lot of hats within our organization, and so it gives them, almost allows them to have value in why they do all the various things they do and how that feeds into the activities that are then tied into the logic model. Does that make sense, Audrey?
It absolutely makes sense. And I think it's so valuable to include everybody in this process, and really being able to see how it impacts their work, how it connects to their work. So absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that information. Yeah.
I would say one additional piece is almost, I see my role as the translator of that, right? Like that folks don't have to know, folks on our front line don't have to know all the details of a logic model. I can be the translator for how their activities and the outputs and the outcomes tie into the logic model. They can call it whatever they want, because at the end of the day, it's really about what is our focus, what is our impact, what are we holding ourselves accountable to, and that's kind of the shared language.
Excellent. And I think that's great as well, because I think a lot of organizations, it can get housed under one individual and only that individual. But it seems like at Denver Urban Scholars, you have someone who's leading it yourself, being able to kind of translate and bridge that, but you have everybody actively involved in some capacity.
Correct.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Susan. And now, Sam, could you walk me through this logic model, what went into the development of it, and how it's being used or could be used?
Okay, so this is, I really like what Susan said, is that, there's different ways to approach developing one. This one was actually created by first looking at, hey, what are we trying to do? What are our outcomes, the long-term outcomes? What do we expect to get from this program? And this was developed this actually isn't the program that I operate, but we developed this to reflect a program that was being developed. This idea that we wanted to help kids matriculate through high school and get in to college. We wanted to also prevent them from engaging in behaviors that would reduce the likelihood that they can matriculate from high school and go into college. So things like criminal behavior, delinquent behavior, things like that. And then we knew, hey, we have a pretty good idea just from developmental psychology and education of what can predict those things we want to prevent and what can promote those things that we want our students to have. And those were really our intermediate outcomes, things like really strong motivation to attend college, having good academic enabler skills like studying or agenda keeping. And then we also wanted to see that they were, doing well with their grades. And then our short-term outcomes were kind of like, hey, what's our immediate benefit of providing a mentor to these kids? Things like positive relationship with their mentors, stronger academic skills, high academic self-efficacy, learning to manage conflicts. And then we kind of went from that to say, okay, we got a good idea of what we want. Let's talk about how we're going to get there. And we kind of looked at our activities, what are available activities? What could we do to get there? And then also considering our inputs about, hey, what do we actually have? How could we get from what our resources are or the demand that we have to these activities that we suspect we'll go through? So I'll just walk us through this really briefly. Is that you have this, some of these are material resources like I talked about, school staff, local business partners, software, things like that. But some of them are immaterial, things like demands, like there's this concern that students are not doing as well as they could be. And I see that as a resource in some ways, that if there's community buy-in or if there's stakeholders that have some skin in the game, that's also a resource that can be leveraged. And then I break up in this logic model the activities between administrative, which is kind of the business side of things. You have to plan meetings, you have to pursue funding, you have to reach out to donors and do some business work. And then there's also some program operation activities, like sometimes mentors play board games with the kids. Other times they do a conflict management curriculum. Then they'll do academic goal setting. And then again, moving those activities over to outputs is how do we actually see this? What are the observables from these activities? And again, they're broken up in administrative versus program. Administrative, you might have numbers that you could count for, how many people do we recruit? Or how many students are referred, how many students complete surveys, or within the actual program, how it's operating, you may have some type of measure of how long things last or how often things are attended. So 1 hour of mentoring that occurs per session, you can measure that when you're going through. Or you could say that mentors spend roughly 50% of their time on fun and games, and then the other 50% they spend on the curriculum. And then I think the other interesting part about this model is that we detail some of these assumptions that we have, and probably the fullest assumptions would be much larger, but you can usually use these assumptions. You can do these assumptions in if-then statements. So taking a look at the first one, if mentors receive at least 2 contacts from supervisors per semester, then they would be better equipped to address their mentees' needs. And that's kind of an overview of this logic model. Like I said, there's lots of different ways to do them, but one thing that Susan and Audrey said that I thought was really important is that outside of kind of using the logic models to, talk to funders and donors and such, the logic model really has no power in itself. Like, it's not magical. It's not going to cause change in your program unless it's connected to specific practices, activities, or behaviors that surround the logic model. Things like measuring what you're doing, revising what you're doing, evaluating how consistently you're implementing things over time. And I think that really the usefulness of a logic model depends completely on how you're using it. What are you actually doing with your program based on the logic model?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam. So before we launch into how we assess logic models, I'd love to actually do another poll to get a better sense of how people are using their logic models, if they're using their logic models. So the poll is, how regularly does your organization use your logic model? Take a minute or two to answer that. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for responding. So it looks like about a third of us still don't have a logic model, which is so fantastic that you're on this call, because you are getting a great framework for the development of a logic model and then how to actually use it. And then it looks like most of our participants kind of fall into, they either have it and they haven't looked at it since it's been developed, or they're using it but not really to its full extent. And then we only have 16% that are really, really solidly using it. So this is just, it's fantastic. And I think we've all got a lot of room for kind of learning from Sam and Susan today about different ways that we can use our logic model and assess it and revise it. So now that we've taken a look at some real life examples of logic model development and use, let's check out how we can assess logic models to see what's working and what can be revised. So first up, Sam, what do you feel is the purpose of assessing our logic models, and what do you feel that this provides for our organizations?
That's a great question. So I think that, the whole purpose of logic models, outside of a tool of communication, to tell others what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it, really is aligned with the increased emphasis probably over the past 40 years in the nonprofit sector on evaluation. You might call it evaluation, quality assurance, quality management. This is, in education nonprofits, you see this come up in things like No Child Left Behind and a lot of the accountability and outcome-oriented policies that have come around. And I think to get to the question of what's the purpose of assessing, first we have to consider kind of what's the purpose of this whole evaluation movement. And I think that in general, probably this increased emphasis on quality assurance, quality management, evaluation, the like, is warranted in fields like mentoring. It's probably a little bit overdue. Like, if you think about the field of mentoring, it's largely thrived, since the kind of major federal funding that started in the 90s, without really any legitimate standards for what constitutes evidence-based practice. And research is still pretty limited. There's lots of good work to be done in mentoring. Though I think one unfortunate thing that's happened as people have realized the need for accountability and evaluation is that the quality assurance strategies that are largely currently being used are simply repackaged industry management practices. And I think it's really important to realize that, you know, most of the existing technology for continuous quality assurance or management of nonprofits and things like this were developed for-profit oriented businesses, for these businesses to compete in for-profit marketplaces that involve, you know, rendering services or goods. And a lot of times quality assurance in these models can be much more easily calibrated because you can look at the bottom line. You can estimate the value of demand based on sales and what the supply is, and you can get immediate feedback on how well you're doing because your price signals will tell you. But in organizations where their primary output or the service that they're rendering is youth development or positive youth development, our bottom line is not that simple. It's astronomically more complex. And I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in whether or not what we're doing helps, how much it helps, or whether or not we should change what we're doing with specific types of youth that we're working with. So from my perspective, the purpose of evaluating and assessing logic models in organizations is to reduce uncertainty about what we do, how we do it, and whether or not it works. And I think the field could benefit most from the first two we're doing and how do we. And for me, that's kind of the bottom line. It's to reduce uncertainty around those questions.
Excellent. And just to drive that point, that's what we're definitely striving for, is reducing uncertainty. And so let's get, Susan, your perspective on this. What are your thoughts on why we should be assessing our logic models regularly and how this can, you know, provide benefits to our organizations?
I love what Sam is saying around reducing uncertainty. And I think for us, it's, as we said, it's a tool that really allows us to know what we need to focus on. It ensures that we're on track in terms of resources we've allocated and activities we're investing in and the outputs we're expecting and the outcomes we're holding ourselves accountable to. You know, for us as an organization, we've gone through a lot of organizational change over the last couple of years due to strategic planning, and including restructuring and changing our program model a little bit. And so we've really relied on this tool to assess a lot of what Sam was saying in terms of what are we doing and how are we doing it, and does that continue to align with even the response we need to have to the outside forces in terms of needs of students, trainings that we need to provide to our mentors in order to better support those students, you know, responding to our school partners and what their needs are. You know, as funding gets cut and social emotional support at the school level, what does that mean for us? And how do we do that in a way that's not about chasing the money, but is really in alignment with the resources we have, the resources we have, the activities we can do, you know, all those pieces along the logic model. So we just feel like it's so important, again, that it's a living document. It's not just something we do once in a while for a funder, but again, as we talked through in the first kind of portion of developing it, how do we develop it in a way that it can be living and it can be breathing and it can be really useful to help guide us in these decisions?
Thank you for sharing those thoughts, Susan. And now I know that you guys have some excellent tools that you use at Denver Urban Scholars to really bring the logic model to life and to assess your logic models. So could you walk us through a couple of these that you actually use that some of our organizations may be able to borrow and apply to their own programs?
Sure. So one of the most useful things I think we've done is implemented regular data use meetings. So we try to do these at least quarterly and sometimes more frequently than that, just depending on what's going on within our organization. And we have folks at the table, so it's often me and other decision makers as well as practitioners. And so most of the time we're using the Emergent Learning Map, and we do have a slide that shows that. Sometimes the data use meeting is just coming together and saying, here is the number of students we've served, here is what we had expected to serve this year, can we kind of brainstorm about what's getting in the way? So I'll run reports from our database and come with actual data, as the name suggests, and figure out how do we solve this problem, or what are the numbers not telling us that we need to account for. The Emergent Learning Map is a tool, again, when you look at it, a lot of our practitioners are like, what are we doing? I really like to take this and write it on one of those big Post-it that are sticky and put it up on the wall. In the middle, what is the optimal duration for the mentoring relationship question? You can pose any framing question there that represents a challenge or decision. As I mentioned, with our strategic planning, we've gone through a process at each of our program levels talking about the optimal duration for the mentoring relationship within Denver Urban Scholars. And then you'll see there are 4 quadrants. What does the data say in the bottom left? Why? So what? Now what? You can start in either the future or in the past. You can start on the right side in the top or bottom quadrant, or you can start on the left side in the past, top or bottom. We tend to start in the bottom left. What does the data say? So again, I come to these meetings with practitioners as well as other decision makers, and we've got data in front of us, and we're literally writing it on a Post-it note. What does the data say? The data says that our average length of relationship is 3.5 years. Our mentor ages are, our average mentor age is 28.3. We literally write down what the data says. Then if you go up into the next quadrant, which is the red why, in addition to why, we're also asking, what is the data not saying, or what are the gaps? Things like anecdotally, we're hearing mentors say, I'm really struggling once I hit the 3-year mark to know what to do with my mentee. I'm really struggling once they hit high school to still be an important part of their life. So what else is the data saying? Then moving into so what? So now what do we do? How does what we know from the data and additional information we've gathered inform that optimal duration question? So for this specific question, it was a lot of, are there other pieces is there other data we need to gather? Like, what are the students saying? Do we need to do some kind of focus group? Do we need to change our mentor training? Do we need to, look at research and what is best practice for similar programs to ours? What are those pieces that then feed into the now what? And the now what is the tangible steps we're going to take leaving the meeting. When we've done it before in the now what, we've actually assigned tasks to people who are at the table so that it's not just like, okay, great, that's a nice Post-it. What are we going to do with it? Again, we really focus on how do we continue to have that be a living process so it doesn't just end there. Then typically after the Emergent Learning Map meeting, or that data use meeting, we'll reconvene to make sure that those steps are being taken. And again, there are so many decisions we've made over the past 2 years around ending, for example, our mentor-mentee relationships when students graduate from high school and go into our post-secondary program. And that was made based on using this Emergent Learning Map. Another activity or tool that we've used a lot is the mason jar activity. So some of you have probably heard the anecdote about, you gotta fill your life up with rocks and pebbles and sand, and you can't just have it be all rocks. You've got to do some things that are similar to sand, the little things in life, and stop and smell the roses, like those types of things. we've taken a little different approach to this activity. We've done it with our staff a couple of times, where really the rocks are representing the bigger impact. So again, when you think of it in the terms of the logic model, what are like the short-term outcomes, the long-term outcomes that we really need to focus our time and energy on? What are the pebbles that go into the jar that are going to help us get there? So we really think of it as those activities that do matter. So trainings, enrolling students in a specific way. And then of course you have to have sand. I mean, in the nonprofit world, you've got to be able to focus on some of that admin kind of stuff. I really like the way that, Sam, you divide up your logic model around the administrative activities, because there does always have to be some of that. But within our agency, how can we focus on making sure that those administrative pieces that we really see as the sand are going to impact the pebbles and the rocks? So this has been a really great activity and tool to just always help us focus. And when Audrey, you were asking even about terminology, we actually use this terminology as a team. Like, is that sand or is that pebbles? You know, or is that a pebble or is that a rock that's really going to help you get somewhere? I don't know if this resonates for any of you on the webinar today, but for many of our students, we're a community-based organization. So for many of our students, it's a lot of calling and calling and calling and calling and calling and really trying to track a student down. And that often feels like the sand. And so forcing us to think, okay, how does the sand become a pebble by engaging students in a different way, where our program managers aren't spending, you know, hours each week trying to track down students. We're thinking, how do we turn an activity or a way to engage them in something other than just a phone call into a pebble?
That's excellent, Susan. I just think it's such a great way to really think through and delve into the data. And it seems like you take a very democratic approach in making this accessible to pretty much any position that could exist within an organization. So before we move on to the next thing, I actually have just one follow-up question with you, which is, considering that you do use your whole team in this, how did you introduce this to your team, and how was it received by staff at first? Because I think that a number of our organizations are fearful and overloading their direct line staff with another thing, or something else that they have to do. But I think that you are certainly using this at Denver Urban Scholars in a really meaningful way across that, across the many positions. So how did you introduce it, and what was the reception by staff?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago, we were a part of a process here in Denver called the Performance Collaborative with our local United Way chapter. And that was really instrumental for us in shaping the way we think about it, that it's not like logic models and evaluation and all that. We all have to do it. And so how can we incorporate this into just, this is a part of what we do and how we do it. And we really have started to use the terminology within our organization of developing a culture of evaluation. So it's not this separate thing that somebody like me is doing on the side. It's informing every day, everything that we're doing. And getting our team bought into that. There's different levels of buy-in, of course, because some folks on our team are licensed clinical social workers, and they're like, what is the purpose of this? Like, just tell me what to do and how to do it. So sometimes those are folks that I'm like, you've got to come to this data use meeting, you've got to be at the table. And sometimes I don't force that, because for them, that feels like the sand. They're willing to do whatever is expected of them, but they don't necessarily need to be a part of the process of shaping it. I think by them knowing, hey, when I come to a staff meeting and Susan's going to share, or my supervisor, the program director is going to share data, like, I want to be a part of knowing that, what that means, how that's informing the decisions that are being made in practice. So it's been an interesting balance, but I'd say by the overarching focus being developing a culture of evaluation, that has impacted everyone coming to the table. And my lens around it is, again, I didn't start out thinking about this. I started out as a licensed clinical social worker. And so how can this even be seen as a professional development opportunity? And how can we train folks within our organization to have this skill set, to have this knowledge, to have the terminology to carry this on?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing those excellent tools and approaches that organizations can use to assess the efficacy of their logic models. And thank you, Sam, as well, for sharing all of that excellent information. So once we've done the assessment, right, we've checked out our logic model, we've assessed it to see if it's working, it's time now to move on to the revision process. So let's take a look at what actually goes into revising a logic model. So Sam, how do you know when it's time to make adjustments to your logic model?
That's a good question. So some of it might just be that there's, something new that you want to try out, or the context changed a bit, or there might be some resources that change, like someone comes or someone goes, might be time to revise it. But I think in terms of actually looking at how the program operates, one way to determine if it's time to change things is to take a look at, hey, where do we want to be based on our logic model? And then building a difference between where we want to be and then where we currently are. So for example, if you're, activities, one of your activities is that we would like to have mentors using motivational interviewing, which is something in my program that we do. We have our mentors trained in motivational interviewing, and they're intended to have these brief motivational interviewing conversations with their mentees. Well, at one point we found out, hey, we're calling it motivational interviewing, we're training them in motivational interviewing, but actually if you listen to the conversations, it's not motivational interviewing, it's nowhere close to it. So we had to come up with a way to bridge the gap, say, this is what we wanted to do, this is what we're training our mentors to do, but when we actually look at the activity, the quality of the activity is remarkably different from how it's being implemented. And that's when it's time to maybe say, hey, do we need something else to really actualize what we're trying to get from this? And what would that be?
Thank you, Sam. And Susan, how do you know when it's time to make these changes at Denver Urban Scholars?
We try to do these, like our data use meetings quarterly. And I'm always just keeping in the back of my mind, how do we need to revise the logic model? We have an outside grant writer, so it's, for me personally, it's been really important to always have this on the forefront, because I've got to make sure she's not sending out an old, outdated logic model if we're making programmatic changes. And if I'm hearing buzz in the office of like, why are we even doing this? I also know that it's time for me to come with some data and some openness to the discussion. Sometimes when people come to the table, like, why are we doing this? It's just out of, it can be various reasons, right? But sometimes there's really something behind that I've really tried to be open to hearing.
Thank you so much, Susan. So in the next topic of this, the people that we involve in the revision process, I know that both of you actively involve lots of different stakeholders in the assessment and revision processes. So Sam, could you talk to me just a bit more about who participates in your revision process, why you've chosen these particular stakeholders, and how you engage them?
So the program that I run typically only has about 4 staff. So it's the director, which is me. We have a full-time school correspondent that helps coordinate the program. And then we typically have 2 graduate students that help manage roughly 70 or so mentors a year. And part of our program, and one of the terms that Susan used that I really love, is this culture of evaluation. And an approach that we use is called a culture of evidence. So one of the things that we really highlight is that everyone is evaluating something based on our logic model. So everyone has something that they are really hyper-focused on, that they are trying to look at from the lens of our logic model and say, are we really doing that? Is it there? How consistently are we doing that? And then what's the quality of that look like? So for example, one graduate student just over the past year, one of the aspects of our logic model is to create kind of a warm environment in school, because a lot of the kids have trouble in school and We particularly target students with elevated disruptive behavior problems. So sometimes they come in, they're pretty frustrated. They've been arguing with teachers and whatnot. And this one graduate student was assigned to the specific task of how we greet each other when the mentees come in the room and what the mentors are doing. And her task that entire semester was to start collecting information on, hey, what might be some great ways to greet mentees when they come in? What if they're frustrated? What if they seem excited about something? What does existing research say about how we can make our greetings have a greater impact? And the student, you know, over the course of a semester really helped us understand how are we on average greeting our mentees or mentors? Are we standing up? Do we shake hands? Do we acknowledge them? Do we ask them, you know, questions? And then how could we do better based on the available evidence? And I think that in this way, using that term that Susan used, a culture of evaluation, this really helps, you know, share the management of continuous quality improvement in the program. It really helps you focus on the margins of the program, like the sand. So, you know, greeting may not be a big, you know, item on your activity list, but making our greetings have the highest impact possible when a mentee comes into a room could just be a little nudge to make our program just a little bit better. And if we distribute that responsibility within our team, we can have many people working to improve many aspects of our program rather than just one external evaluator coming in and saying, you aren't greeting well, you're not doing motivational interviewing, and your kids aren't coming to the program.
This is so great how you have really looked at these, you know, small changes and engaging everyone. And I love the term hyper-focused. I really think that that's a kind of great adjective or approach to this. So how do you determine who hyper-focuses on what? And this is a follow-up for you, Sam.
So some of that is based on interest. So a lot of our graduate students are getting geared up to complete a master's thesis or a dissertation. So it's convenient for them to have some specific aspect of the program that they would like to focus on or they have some interest in. Other times, though, for example, with our full-time school staff, it's stuff that they really have, you know, firsthand account to. They can actually see how these things are. Like parent meetings, when you're meeting with a parent to talk about the program, they're the one that's actually in that context. And it would actually be a little bit removed and maybe even artificial if I were to try and go in and observe those or make changes to those. So, you know, getting someone that's really close to the aspect of the logic model that you're focusing on, I think is also a really helpful way to assign who might be a best fit to look at that. And then on the other hand, it might be good to have, you know, someone from the outside looking in to, you know, have a sounding board for how things are going or how they look.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And Susan, who do you have participating in your revision process and how do you engage these individuals?
Yeah, it kind of varies depending on what the revision is or what we feel like the revision might be. We tend to work in teams based on programs. So, you know, the middle school team has 3 people, the high school team has 4 people, the post-secondary team has 1 person. Then we have a program director who supervises those folks. So it's typically her, me, and then whoever's on the team. We also partner with a couple of local graduate schools to have interns. They typically have to do a project during their time with us. And so depending on, like Sam was saying, what their interests are and what their, you know, capstone project is going to be on, they may be engaged in the process too. We also have a program committee that is folks who do not work for Denver Urban Scholars. It's 4 folks who we can take things to and say, here's what we're thinking. Can you help us adjust? Or does this make sense to sort of outsiders? I mean, they're insiders in many ways, but they're also outsiders. Or can you help us make this decision? But we always try to start with the internal people. So, you know, they know that the folks who are on the front lines are able to bring their questions, their concerns, their issues, the messaging they're getting from mentors, mentees, school partners to the table to then make informed decisions and changes if needed.
Thanks, Susan. It really seems like you and Sam have just great ways of getting buy-in from your different stakeholders and keeping them involved in the process. So I'd love to talk just a bit more about the actual steps that you both take in this revision process with your teams. But before doing so, I just want to remind everybody to send in questions. We will be coming up to our Q&A in just a couple minutes. So please send in any of those last-minute questions in the next 5 or so minutes. So Susan, can you walk us through an example of how you actually did this at Denver Urban Scholars?
You bet. I think there is yes. So this is an example of a tool that we use. I don't know about you guys, but we collect a boatload of information in our mentor applications and our student applications. And going through a process, a data audit, basically, that looked at why are we collecting this information. So you'll see across the top, case management, continuous improvement. I can't remember now what CI meant, but you'll notice none of that is checked here. Donor reporting, marketing, advocacy. And so we went through and with each question on our application, okay, does the birthplace, why are we collecting that information? For us, the birthplace can inform case management. We work with a lot of immigrants and refugees, and just knowing, were they born in the US, were they not born in the US, how might that inform the approach that the case manager would use? Ethnicity, it's case management, but it's also oftentimes something what we're doing for, or reporting for donors. So we went through this with all of our applications because, as I said, we were collecting so much information, but we weren't actually using it. And so that was getting into my whole activity around sand, pebbles, rocks, right? It was a really useful tool for us, and you'll see in the next slide that a lot of what we were collecting wasn't really impacting what we thought it was impacting. So internally, a lot of our program managers were saying, why are we collecting this? This is just for donors. And when you look at the chart, actually, not a lot of it was for donors. We were intentionally collecting stuff for case management, but our case managers weren't actually using that information. So there was an opportunity for us to, again, assess resources, activities, and how that information informs, even just from data collection, why we're doing what we're doing. I should add, it was a bit of a process, but I think the investment of time in the process to create the little chart and to go through each of our applications was actually, you know, you invest the time up front and then it created more efficiency and efficacy down the road.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing this example. I think that really helps to illustrate and bring to life what this could look like within our own organizations. And Sam, I know that you also have this excellent tool to share with us for the revision process. So can you walk us through what your revision process has looked like at AMP mentoring, and then also this actual 3-step empowerment evaluation that organizations can potentially use?
Right, thank you. So I think, you know, the one big thing to consider that we, you know, revisit just about every year is, what are we trying to do? What's our mission? What values drive those missions? Why are we trying to do this? And, you know, what do we hope to do? And we just did an empowerment evaluation with a local organization that's looking at this. And I think that oftentimes asking the question of why are we doing this, and then, you know, challenging it to get as specific as possible. You know, why specifically are you doing the things that you do, to get a mission, to come up not just with one mission statement, but multiple missions, and go through each of those. If you have a good idea of what you want to do, then I think you can start critically thinking about what you're doing, whether you're doing it well or not, and how you might be able to improve it. So the 3-step empowerment evaluation process, if you're interested in empowerment evaluation, Abe Wandersman, who's actually at the University of South Carolina too, he's an expert on this, and he's shared a lot of his expertise with me on it. But this is basically a way to start asking questions. Why are we doing things? How well are we doing? And what can we do to improve it? And the 3-step approach is where you establish a mission, like I was talking about, get a common set of values that you can do. You can do this on a blackboard or a projector using PowerPoints or Excel sheets, whatever. And then after you get a good idea of, hey, this is our this is our vision. These are our missions that we have. Start going through with an exhaustive list of what are the activities that are necessary to meet the mission. What do we expect to be doing with our mentors, with our agency, organization at the administrative level? Every activity that we have to meet our mission. And I like to have, when we're doing this with our vision and our mission and our activities, every single person that is a stakeholder in our organization. So we get the school principals in there, we get the counselors in there, we get even some of our mentors to come in and do this, and we all participate collaboratively. And then one of the really challenging parts of this is you actually democratically prioritize your activities. So each person gets 5 dot stickers or 5 tokens, and they're allowed to place these stickers next to the activities that they believe to be most important and consistent with the mission that they're doing. So a person could place all 5 on one value or one activity that they have, or they could spread them out between activities. Then after you get a good list of maybe the top 10 activities that you think your organization is doing, you get everyone involved, and you can create like a matrix to do this. And you go through each of the top 10 prioritized activities, and you rate how well you think you're doing, and you bring data to the table. You say, hey, we think that parent home visits are really important, but we're actually only doing it with about 5% of our kids. And you go through and you talk 1 to 10, how well is this working? And then if you've got a gap between where you want to be and where you are right now, you start creating actionable goals and figuring out a way to monitor progress towards these goals.
Excellent. And for everybody on the call, we do have this resource actually available on your control panel so that you can access the full resource in PDF form. And then Sam, did you want to provide a little bit more information on that slide, or have you already covered all of those pieces?
I think it might be helpful just to go through some of the key questions, because I think that a lot of this can get pretty abstract pretty fast. So it sounds great, and it sounds, like a really great way to improve your program. But actually, what do you do when you're sitting down with a bunch of people can be kind of hard. So I think one of the great ways to do this is, to ask your group questions. What's important to us? What values do we want our organization to embody? And then really exhaustively listing the activities that we do to reach those missions. And I like the question when we're doing activities, a group that we just worked with this past month, they wrote down 15 activities that they asked their program. And the person I was doing this with, we just kept asking, what else? What else do you do? Is that all? What else do you do? And we ended up with about 50 activities that they did after you keep asking what else. And then some of those latter identified activities ended up being some of the most important when we started democratically identifying which of the activities were priorities. And then I think a really helpful part of this is rating your success subjectively, where 1 is kind of like we're failing catastrophically or not doing it at all, and 10 is like there's no way that we can improve what we're doing. And then start to develop action steps and identify measures, asking questions like, hey, if we're at a 5 right now, what would it take to move us from a 5 to a 6? What could we do just a little bit better to move the needle on this activity? And then I think a really important thing is after you do these type of activities, you need to have an action team, a team that is specifically responsible for leading the charge on moving the needle on how well we're doing our activities or how well we're monitoring our outputs and whatnot like that. So I love asking these questions, and I think questions are a great way to start driving action around these items.
Thank you so much, Sam. So that brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you, Susan and Sam, for sharing your expertise, experience, and enthusiasm with all of our participants and everybody who will listen to this afterward as well. Our panelists have provided some really excellent tools and resources, and we want to give you just 2 more for your logic model and evaluation needs. So we have the Community Builders Approach to Theory of Change that is through the Aspen Institute, and this will give you lots and lots of information about the development of theory of change, about logic models, and a lot of just background information for you as well. And then for those of you that are looking for evaluation instruments and measures, if you have not accessed the Measurement Guidance Toolkit for Mentoring Programs that Mentor has produced and is available through the National Mentoring Resource Center, do this today. It's excellent. There are so many different validated tools on there, and it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. So I know that many of you have been sending in excellent questions throughout this webinar. So we've got about 7 to 10 minutes perhaps left for Q&A. So Dusty Ann, do you have a few great questions to close us out?
Yeah, yeah. People have been having all kinds of good questions, and I've been trying to give some short answers to folks since we don't know how many we'll get to. It seems like there are several questions that are, you know, with this kind of topic, there's a lot of technical little questions. So I had several little technical questions about certain boxes in the logic models. I had several questions along the way asking for more detail about how you identify your outcomes. I think that the presenters did address that question, but it could always go into more detail. And then I had a couple of questions about once you have your outcomes, how do you identify measures and instruments and whether those should go in the logic models. So my thought was maybe we could pick off a couple of the quick technical questions, maybe with short answers from the presenters if that's okay, and then hopefully there'll be time for them to just say a few more words about how you develop your outcomes. Does that seem useful?
Absolutely. Take us through it, Dusty Ann.
Okay, great. So one of the questions was regarding outputs. Someone was surprised that you would name your program participants as outcomes. So they wanted to know, would something like an individual action plan or development plan also be an output? So I think generally just more about what goes into that output category.
And Sam, do you maybe want to take this question first?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that, you know, the outputs are, I like to think about it in terms of the volume or the, you know, measurable products of your activities. And I think that, you know, recruitment, an output of recruitment activities could be people. If you're referring to the first logic model that we showed, I think that there's a list of kind of the demographics, and we might really want to stratify how we're recruiting, and that could be an excellent output that we're getting, something that we can count and measure. I think that also if we're, you know, providing activities, we also want to measure the volume or the frequency or, you know, the duration of the activities that we're providing. So it's not just that we do, you know, conflict management instruction. It's how often are we doing that? When we do it, how long do we do it? How many of our mentees should be getting it? It's looking at those questions of volume. So what are our activities actually producing?
Great. Okay. Someone also wanted to know, as a school-based group mentoring program, is it appropriate to include school staff and administration in the development of the logic model? And when I first read that, I thought they meant, does that go in that input box? But I think they might actually be asking, should you involve your school staff and administration in developing your logic model? So I'm going to guess that's a yes, but take it away.
And I'm actually going to ask Susan if you could tackle this since you work with so many schools at Denver Urban Scholars.
Sure. You know, we haven't specifically engaged them in the logic model per se, but we have definitely sat down. We have almost like an assessment tool that we use to go through, you know, how's the partnership going? What new resources have you gained this year that could impact, you know, our partnership? We have kind of just a process that we go through, and typically it's decision makers at the school and then decision makers within our organization, as well as the program manager. We typically have one program manager per school site, so typically that person as well. And I think that that has been not only beneficial on our end to get their feedback and their input and all of that, but it's also shown that we truly are partners with them. We're not doing this in a vacuum, that we really have to come together to make sure that we're on the same page, that, again, we're holding ourselves accountable to the same things. We're in the process of going deeper within one of our schools and doing some like pilot programming. And we've even recently had conversations around what evaluation tools should we be using? Is this in alignment with what you guys as the school want to see our impact and outcomes being? You know, it's not up to them to make all those decisions on their own, of course, but we come to the table to have an informed conversation, including data, including sustainability for our staff, all those pieces. So I think absolutely yes. As much as your organization and time allows, I just think that pays off. Investing that time and energy pays off in the long run for various reasons.
Helpful, thank you. Okay, and so then let's turn to these questions about a little more detail perhaps about how one develops outcomes. I had several questions related to that. One person asked, is there ever a logic model that starts with the outcomes and works backwards, because that makes more sense logically, and I responded that we often do start with our outcomes and work backwards, but when we reflect it in a logic model, we reflect it forward. So if anybody wants to add to that comment, please do. But related, others were asking, one person asked for the super scholars logic model, how did they determine the outcomes? So that could be one way to help people understand better how we develop these outcomes, is you could use the super scholars logic model as an example. So just any further comments on how you go about this process of identifying outcomes and how you can be sure that they will predict what you want them to predict.
I can take a stab at that one. I think that the first question that was asked is, you can develop your logic model forwards or backwards. And I think in some circumstances, it might be wise to start with your inputs to see what do you have and kind of what are your resources that you're available, because you don't want to, try and develop outcomes that might be unreasonable based on the resources that you have. For example, if you're providing college scholarships to every student, and that's like one of the outcomes that you have is that they get accepted and they've got their college paid for. But if you don't really have a way to raise the funds for that, then you might want to target a different outcome. But I think that probably it's more intuitive to start with where you want to go, which I think goes into the second question, which is how do you identify your outcomes? And I think a good way to do this is to start with those values, priorities, and missions questions. Is what are we here for? What are we trying to do? What do we want to do with the kids that we're working with? And say you have a long-term outcome, which might be, some of the easier questions. I want them to go to college and I want them to make it through college. Then you can start looking at some of the research literature on, hey, what are some, changeable things about kids that help them go to college? Or what are some things that prevent them from going to college? And what could our program do to actually intervene at those levels? So one of the big things for us is that we know that conduct problems in school predict conduct problems after school and after they, matriculate from school. So we're pretty serious. That's one of our major outcomes, is that we want to take a look at how we can intervene at the conduct level and how we can manage disputes between students and how we can give them some skills to manage conflict and to negotiate with their teachers in a reasonable and respectful way. And we got there because we realized that, hey, a lot of our kids are getting expelled or suspended because they're being disrespectful to teachers, or they're fighting each other, whatnot like that. Or you might say, hey, we want our kids to do well on the SAT. What are some things that can help kids do better on the SAT? It could be tutoring or getting organized for their classes, particularly their math classes and things like that. So, but I think the first thing to start with is, hey, what's our mission? What's our values? What do we want to do?
Thank you, Dusty-Ann, for queuing up those questions for us. That actually does bring us to the end of our Q&A. So if your questions didn't get answered, we encourage you to reach out directly to our awesome panelists. Thank you so much, panelists, for being here. This has really been just a tremendous conversation and opportunity to, learn more about how you do what you do and what this can really look like in real life. So as we kind of close out, we would love for you to check out the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center website for no-cost mentoring resources to help you apply evidence-based mentoring practices to your program. The OJJDP NMRC provides evidence reviews on mentoring models, mentoring for special populations, implementation resources from training manuals to mentor guides, and they're all reviewed by the NMRC Research Board. A blog featuring innovations and best practices for mentoring practitioners, and the opportunity to request no-cost training or technical assistance. And we have myself as well as Dusty Ann are both technical assistance providers, and we just have a huge, huge team of people that are providing the support. Additionally, we encourage you to register your program with the Mentoring Connector, which is a national database of mentoring programs. It's zip code searchable database and allows mentors and mentees from across the country to find your program. It's also connected to LinkedIn, NBA Cares, mentor.gov, and just tons of other avenues of free program promotion. Just as a reminder for everybody on the call, 1 week after this webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series webpage, where we'll post the recording, slides, and additional resources. And don't forget that we want your feedback. So at the end of today's webinar, when you click out, please answer this short survey and help us to make this series even better. Be sure to visit Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series page on Mentor's website for an archive of all past webinars and information about upcoming webinars. We have tons and tons available. So if you are interested in a topic, chances are we've covered it at some point, and you can check it out and get that information. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. We certainly hope that you'll join us next month on September 21st for our next webinar on sports-based mentoring. Thank you all, and we hope you have an excellent day.